The girl stood barefoot in the fluorescent glow of the gas station, clutching a torn sketchbook against her chest like a shield. Rain ran from her hair in quiet rivers, soaking the gray hoodie that hung off her frame like a forgotten flag. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the highway behind her was a blur of tire hiss and red taillights bleeding into the night. The clerk, a sleepy man with a mustache that looked more painted than grown, stared at her like she might vanish if he blinked too hard. She didn't speak. She just pointed at the shelf of plastic-wrapped sandwiches and then looked down, her eyes refusing the weight of pity. The officer had been leaning against the cruiser outside, sipping burnt coffee from a styrofoam cup, his radio crackling quietly with the static lullaby of the midnight shift. He saw her silhouette through the glass, that small frame too still, too precise, like a charcoal drawing set against the chaos of the world. When he walked in, his boots left muddy prints on the tile. "You lost, sweetheart?" His voice tried to be gentle but fell somewhere between worry and weariness. She didn't answer. She turned her head just enough for him to see the bruise under her eye, a smudge of yellow and violet like spoiled fruit, and then reached into her sketchbook with deliberate fingers. One page, then two, then a third, fluttered free like dying birds and drifted to the floor at his feet. The officer bent down. His breath caught. The first drawing was a man in his 30s, with tired eyes and a smile just beginning to forget how. The second was a woman, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a song only she could hear. The third, two boys, twins maybe, their features so precise they seemed to blink from the page. He picked them up slowly, his gloved hand trembling. "Who are these people?" he asked, voice low now, like a secret whispered into a cathedral. She looked up at him then, really looked, and in that moment the fluorescent light flickered like a failing heartbeat. "My family," she said. 3 words. No tremor. No tears. Just cold fact, the kind that cracks you clean in half. The officer called it in, voice shaking now as dispatch answered. 10 minutes later, the precinct was glowing with screens and whispers. An old detective with hands that smelled of nicotine leaned over the drawings and turned pale. That's the Henderson case. From 5 years ago. They vanished. The entire family. No trace." The girl sat silently in a plastic chair, watching the chaos orbit her like a dying star. Her fingers moved again, this time sketching without prompting, lines flowing from her pencil like they'd been waiting for this moment all her life. A house appeared on the page. A blue one, with chipped paint and a wind chime shaped like the moon. Then a room. A small room. Purple walls. A bed with stuffed animals. A crack in the corner of the ceiling. She handed it to the officer. "That's where they kept me," she said. That word, they, landed like a blade on the tile floor, and no one dared pick it up. The captain came down 2 flights of stairs, with his shirt half buttoned and a face carved from granite. He stared at the girl for a long time before speaking. "Where is this house?" She shrugged. "I don't know where it is. I only know what it looks like." They scanned the drawings. They ran them against old case files. They fed them into AI software that matched structures against aerial maps, but the results came up cold. The detective with the nicotine hands sat beside her, rubbing his jaw. "You're saying you remember this? From where they kept you? So, you're saying you were taken, too?" She looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment, he saw a flicker behind her eyes, something ancient and wounded and furious. "I don't remember being taken," she said. "But I remember waking up." She tapped the sketch of the room. "I remember the twins crying. Every night. One of them used to sing when he thought no one could hear. The man in the first drawing, he tried to protect us. But they made him stop." The officer stared. "Who made him stop?" Her eyes dropped to the floor, and she whispered something so quiet he had to lean in to hear. "The man with the voice." The captain's radio hissed. A voice came through, sharp with adrenaline. "We got something. A match on the structure in the background of the drawing. The wind chime, the blue siding, it matches a farmhouse 30 miles out, condemned. Nobody's been there in years. The captain was already walking. Gear up. We're going. But the girl didn't move. It's not empty, she said. They're still there. She didn't mean the family. The convoy of cars cut through the fog like scalpel blades. Rain fell in a slanted sheet, slicing through the dark woods that lined the road like sentries. When they arrived, the farmhouse looked like it had been waiting. Vines clung to the siding like fingers. The wind chime swayed, even though there was no wind. Inside, the smell of rot and time hit them like a wave. Floorboards groaned. The team moved like shadows, guns drawn, flashlights cutting slices of light through the dark. Clear, someone said. But it wasn't. The basement door was half open. The girl had followed them in without a sound, and when she reached the door, she stopped and stared. He's still here, she whispered. He doesn't leave until he knows we forget. The first officer, Tomlin, went down with 2 others. The descent felt endless. The light flickered. The air was wrong. Not just stale, but off, like it had been sealed with something ancient and cruel. They found the room. Purple walls. Crack in the ceiling. A single stuffed animal, matted with mildew. And drawings. Hundreds of them. Taped to the walls. Drawings of children. Faces. Screaming. Laughing. Waiting. Jesus Christ, Tomlin muttered. Then something moved behind them. Something that hadn't been breathing seconds before. Upstairs, the girl sat in the old armchair by the broken fireplace, sketchbook in her lap, pencil dancing. She was drawing again. Her hand shook. Her eyes were unfocused. You should go, she said to the detective who had stayed behind. You should all go. He crouched beside her. What's happening? Her pencil stopped. Her voice was a whisper. He's waking up. The radio screamed. One of the officers downstairs. Then silence. The detective's hand moved to his gun. He stood, eyes darting to the staircase, then back to her. Who is he? She looked up at him. He was my first drawing. Her voice cracked. Before I even knew how to hold a pencil. And then she handed him the last page of the sketchbook. It was a face. Vague. Blurred. Like the memory of something before language. But the eyes, they were real. Realer than the paper. Realer than anything. The detective felt them crawl into his mind and start pulling. We need to burn this place, she said. Not arrest. Not document. Burn. And then the scream came from the basement. But it wasn't the voice of a cop. It was a child. And it wasn't coming up, it was coming out. The scream clawed its way through the air like a wire dragged across bone, and the detective, his name was Marrow, though no one had said it aloud in hours, dropped the sketchbook and bolted for the basement door, nearly slipping on the wet, mold-slick floor as he descended into the stink of old screams and stagnant grief. His flashlight bounced with his breath, slicing through dust and cobwebs, and when he found Tomlin, the man was on his knees in front of the purple wall, vomiting into his own shaking hands, his gun dropped somewhere in the dark. The other 2 officers were farther back, one retching against the corner, the other frozen like a statue, staring at something on the far wall. Marrow turned his light, slowly. The wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Kids, parents, strangers, faces taped in overlapping patterns like someone was trying to trap them mid-thought. Some of the eyes were burned out. Others scratched through. A few had been drawn over, pencil lines etched so deeply into the paper that the wood underneath had buckled. And in the center, one photograph, bigger than the rest. The Hendersons. The same faces from the girls' sketches. The same smiles. But their eyes, red. Not digitally altered, not bloodshot. Red, like something inside had ruptured and bled out through their souls. Marrow stepped back. Something behind the wall moved. Just a shift, a creak, a breath. Back upstairs, he said, calm but shaking, his voice the last thing keeping them from falling apart. Now! They ran, stumbling into the upstairs hallway like men thrown from a ship. The girl was still in the chair, sketchbook on the floor, eyes closed. We found them, Marrow said, but she didn't respond. He crouched in front of her, shaking her shoulders. You hear me? We found them. Her lips parted. No, she whispered. You found where they stopped screaming. And then the house made a sound. Not the walls. Not the wood. The house. A deep, aching groan like lungs expanding for the first time in years. Out! Marrow barked. Get everyone out, now! But the radios were dead. The lights flickered once, twice, and then blacked out, leaving them wrapped in the sound of rain and old breath. Marrow grabbed the girl, lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, like lifting guilt, and moved toward the front door. But it wasn't there. Just wall. A flat, blank wall where the door had been. No seams. No knob. Tomlin cursed and tried to kick through it, but the wood didn't give, not even an inch. Marrow looked around, the air thick with panic. Fire, he said suddenly. We start a fire. Smoke draws attention. Forces breach. He won't let you, the girl said, voice quiet. He only lets you out if you forget. Marrow stared at her, the pieces clicking together in the back of his mind. Is that what happened to you? She looked away. I tried to forget. 4 years. But they kept coming back. Their faces. Their voices. Her eyes met his again, hollow with memory. So I started drawing. So I wouldn't forget. And suddenly it was all there. Why she was homeless. Why she never stayed in one place. Why she didn't speak for months at a time. The memories were anchors. She drew to remember, and remembering kept her safe, but it also kept her his. Marrow stood slowly, rage and helplessness gnawing at the corners of his jaw. Then we remember. Together. He turned to the others, who were shaking but alert. We get out by remembering. Every goddamn thing. We say their names. We tell their stories. We put light on all of it. That's how we break the walls. The others hesitated. You think that'll work? Tomlin asked. I don't know, Marrow said. But I know doing nothing means dying here and being added to the wall. He picked up the sketchbook, flipped it open, and shoved a pencil into the girl's hand. Draw the house. Everything. The inside. The basement. The photos. Him. Especially him. She blinked, then nodded, and her pencil began to move. The other officers began to speak, half whispers, muttered memories. Names from the case file. Details from the scene. Marrow closed his eyes and forced himself to remember the photo, the eyes, the red. He pulled out his phone, tapped on the last image he took before the signal cut, a blur of the wall, and stared into it, repeating to himself, they were real, they were real, they were real. Then footsteps. Not theirs. Not the girl's. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from below. Tomlin raised his gun. We still don't know what he is. Marrow didn't look away from the stairs. Doesn't matter. We know what we are. The girl's voice came from behind them, soft but rising. He feeds on the silence. That's why they kept us quiet. That's why the room had no windows. He needs you to forget the sound of your own name. And just as she said it, the hallway shifted. The ceiling dropped an inch. The wallpaper began to curl inward like skin blistering under a flame. Keep talking, Marrow ordered. Anything. Your life, your regrets, your first kiss. I don't care. Fill the air. Drown him in noise. The men began to speak. Fragments. Confessions. One spoke about his daughter. Another, his brother who never came back from deployment. Marrow talked about his wife, how he cheated, once, and never forgave himself. The girl drew faster, her hand a blur of motion. And beneath it all, the footsteps kept climbing. Slower now. Like the thing below was listening, thinking, maybe even doubting. The wall near the fireplace cracked, just a hairline, but enough. Enough to see a glimpse of night on the other side. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made people do desperate things. Marrow reached for the fire poker and jammed it into the crack. "Push!" he yelled. They heaved. The wall groaned like it didn't want to let go. The house was resisting, like a mouth closing around a word it didn't want spoken. "Say their names!" the girl screamed. "All of them!" Marrow shouted them. Michael, Sarah, Lucas, Eli, and the wall screamed back, a deafening, guttural wail that wasn't made by anything with lungs. The crack widened. They could see stars. The rain. Freedom. "One more push!" The house howled. The girl dropped her pencil and screamed too, not in fear, but with all the pain she'd swallowed for years. The sound of every night spent alone, every memory doubted, every face she'd drawn just to prove she hadn't imagined the horror. And that's when they saw it, half in shadow, half in light, on the stairs. Not a monster. Not a demon. A man. Plain clothes. Average height. A face you forget in seconds. But his eyes, those eyes were every lost child's nightmare. And his voice, when it came, was calm. Almost friendly. "You're making a mistake." Marrow didn't answer. He shoved the poker again. The wall cracked open, the wind rushed in, and something broke loose inside the house. A moan, low and long, like it was bleeding history. The girl stood up. For the first time since the station. Her voice cut through the air. "I remember everything." The man at the stairs flinched. And Marrow knew. This wasn't about ghosts. Or monsters. This was about memory. About truth. And what the world tries to bury when it's too ashamed to look at it. He turned to the others. "Get her out. Now!" Tomlin grabbed her. They ran. The hole was wide enough. Rain slapped their faces. And behind them, the man started moving. Slowly. No rush. Like he knew he'd find them again. Because forgetting always comes back. The house burned like it had been waiting for the flame. Like every board and nail had prayed for release, and finally, someone had struck the match with a steady hand. No explosion. No cinematic fireball. Just a long, steady crackle, the quiet kind of destruction that feels more like exorcism than spectacle. Marrow stood across the field, rain soaking through his coat, eyes fixed on the collapsing roof line, like he was afraid it might try to stand up again. The girl sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket one of the paramedics had left behind, sketchbook in her lap, but the pencil unmoving. She hadn't spoken since they broke through the wall. Didn't cry. Didn't shake. Just sat there like a witness at a trial that had finally adjourned. A detective from another unit tried to get her to talk, ask the usual questions, press the usual buttons. Marrow waved him off. She didn't need more questions. She needed silence that didn't hurt. The official report would say arson. Probably. Or maybe electrical failure. The photos in the basement, confiscated, catalogued, buried in some evidence locker where truth goes to wait its turn. But those who were there knew. And those who knew didn't sleep much afterward. They found the remains of the Hendersons beneath the floorboards, like relics buried beneath a church that had long since lost its God. The twins had held hands. Someone had taken the time to arrange that. Marrow drove the girl to the edge of the city 2 days later. No words. Just the soft hum of the engine, and the sound of her turning pages in the sketchbook. She hadn't drawn the man again. Not even once. She stopped at a group home outside Lansing, the kind with peeling green paint and a woman at the door who smiled like she'd seen every kind of broken. "She's not ready to be a daughter," Marrow had said quietly, handing over the folder of names, files, details. "But she remembers what one looks like." The woman nodded and said nothing else. Just open the door and let the girl in. And that was it. No hugs. No promises. Just a quiet, careful beginning. Marrow didn't go back to the precinct right away. Took a leave. Didn't explain. The captain didn't ask. He spent mornings sitting on the roof of his building with a mug of cold coffee and a notepad he never wrote in. Every now and then, he thought about calling his wife. Every now and then, he didn't. There was an ache in his chest that hadn't been there before. Old guilt, maybe, or something newer, heavier. Like the weight of someone else's memory he'd agreed to carry just a little while longer. Sometimes, he saw faces in windows. Not ghosts, just memories catching up. One afternoon in late October, he got a letter. No return address. Just a single sketch folded inside. Pencil on plain paper. A girl, maybe 13 now. Sitting in a chair, sketchbook on her lap. A window behind her. And sunlight, pouring in like it belonged there. In the bottom corner, 2 words, scribbled faint. Still here. Marrow smiled, just barely. Then folded the drawing and tucked it into the notepad he never used. He went back inside. The city was still moving. People still forgot. But he remembered. And he'd make sure she didn't have to remember alone. Somewhere in the city, a wind chime rang, just once. A sound like breath. Then silence. But this time, the silence didn't hurt.